Welcome to our lecture on Confucianism. So here in our first image we have some pictures, some paintings of what Confucius might have looked like. Remember, Confucianism, just like Taoism, Buddhism, and Jainism, all developed in the 6th century BCE, which is about 2,500 years ago. One of the questions that people ask is whether or not Confucianism is a bona fide religion. Is this more of a political philosophy? People argue. There are no priests, there's no divinely inspired writings. There are writings. Confucius had teachings, but he himself was not seen as a divine figure, as a god. So, if one were to draw an analogy between Confucius and, say, Jesus of Nazareth, that would be an incorrect analogy, because for Christians, Jesus is considered to be the Son of God, is considered to be divine, but Confucius is just an ordinary person, just an ordinary man, maybe a man who was wise and had important information to pass along to the people, but not someone to worship. So we count it as a religion because of how it has been treated historically, but if you analyze Confucianism, you can make the argument that it's more of a political philosophy than it is a religion. Let's get into the life of Confucius. He's born in 551 BCE, so that's the 6th century before the Common Era. And for some of you might know from your history classes that during China there was social and political upheaval. Confucius was born into wealth, just like Siddhartha, Gautama, and Mahavira. Despite the fact that the feudal states, that was what was there was social and political upheaval because of the decline of the feudal states in China at the time. Confucius's father was this famous warrior, and he was noted for his strength and mightiness even into his elderly years. So his father was 70 years old when Confucius was born, and legend has it that he was not just figuratively a big leader, but he was literally a very, very large warrior. Even though he's born into wealth, he that wealth did not last for very long, because his father dies, and and Confucius is raised actually in poverty by his widowed mother. So the money did not get passed on to the widow just because of the culture at the time. It might go to a brother or might go back to the state. He gets interested in government at an early age. When he's a teenager, he accepts a minor government position. And we see similar stories to these people that are born in the 6th century. Instead of the father dying at birth for Siddhartha, it was his mother that dies 7 days after he's born. Born into wealth in both cases, even though for Confucius it didn't last. But then again, you have a transition from wealth into poverty, just like Mahavira and Siddhartha experienced. Confucius also, is believed, got married and had one child, a son, just like Siddhartha did. He eventually got divorced, according to some records. So he started his political career early, when he's a teenager, and eventually when he's in his 50s, at 50 years old, he's made prime minister by the Duke of Lu. And one of the reasons why people are so interested in Confucianism today, even after almost 2,500 years, is that the social framework and social political setup that Confucius created was very much ideal. His government was ideal. Crime was very low. People didn't even need to lock their doors. If you dropped your wallets in the streets of China at this time, it would just stay there for a long time. No one would even think to steal it, even though they could get away with it. And as it says there, he emphasized equitable social order over gods and religion and worship of deities. At 67 years old, he went from being the prime minister to an advisor to not the Duke of Lu, but the Duke of Ai, which is spelled A-I. And it was at that time that he wrote down his wisdom into the teachings, or what are known as the Analects of Confucius. We'll talk about that and the spelling in just a little bit. So here's the big idea with Confucianism. Here is the crux of Confucius's political philosophy. It's instructions or directions on how social harmony can be achieved. And the way that social harmony is achieved is by the cultivation of virtues. Many consider Confucianism to be a sort of virtue ethics. In Western philosophy, there's a famous virtue ethics that was authored by a famous ancient Greek philosopher, Aristotle. So you've got Aristotle's virtue ethics, and some draw a comparison to Confucius and his idea of the virtues. Others will say that this isn't a fair comparison, but that's for a different sort of class. There are lots of different virtues that are emphasized in Confucianism. We're going to talk about these four, and the first one is Ren. There's a lot of different ways to translate Ren. As you can see there, love, human goodness, humanity, benevolence, true manhood, moral character. So there's a lot of different ways to understand its meaning, but I think love and human goodness really capture the meaning. If someone is very cynical about human nature, then they tend to think that deep down we're selfish, self-interested, only looking out for ourselves. But if you're optimistic about human nature, then your belief would be that human beings deep down, there's a goodness inside of us, and it's common to all human beings. And so if you believe the latter, if you're an optimist about human nature, then the core or the essence of that goodness is Ren. The next moral virtue is Yi. Yi is moral intuition. So because of our innate human goodness, we have good intuitions about right and wrong. So if you are faced with a moral dilemma, it's your moral intuition, which is sort of a moral compass that will steer you in the direction of what is morally just or correct. So Ren is our goodness, kind of at our core, and that makes possible our moral intuition, which is Yi. And then Li, the next virtue, is translates best to proper conduct or propriety or etiquette. So that is our ethical core. That's our Ren translated into action, into behavior. So if we are in tune with our moral goodness, then that will drive our moral compass to be pointed in the right direction. And then when it comes to our actions, they will be righteous and just because of Li. So Li could be considered to be living out a set of rules that, if followed, will lead to social and political harmony. There are lots of laws in countries. Many of them are okay. Some of them are even flatly prejudiced and unjust. And if there are rules that are unjust, then that's not in line with Li. Li would manifest in a political or in a state sense if a country has laws that are morally just. So if you believe that, for instance, today the United States is making moral progress, if we're passing laws that are better, so if you believe that the law for anti-discrimination, or the hundreds of years ago when we passed the law banning slavery, if you think that that's in the proper direction, then those laws would be examples of Li. Xiao is reverence or respect for one's parents, and we know that this is an important part of Chinese culture, as we saw in Taoism. And that reverence for parents can extend to other family members and to society as a whole. So here's how you spell Analects. Roughly, it means teachings of Confucius. These are the writings. We talked about all different texts and different traditions. We talked about sutras and Buddhism, the Vedas and Hinduism, the Tao Te Ching and Taoism, and now we have the Analects in Confucianism. So I'm just going to go over a few lines from the Analects that I think are kind of interesting. One of them is, choose a job you love and you will never have to work a day in your life. That's something that you might have heard and might have attributed to Western culture, but historians believe that Confucius roughly said something like this. This is in English, of course. Confucius didn't write in English, so this is a translation, but the meaning is about the same. And I think that this is a powerful quotation, the idea being that if you have a job you don't like, that's going to be really difficult to do for a short period, if not for an entire career. But if you do what you love, and in a sense, it's not really work, you enjoy it. And since we spend, roughly 40 hours a week once you finish school, or once you are at a certain point in your life, you spend 40 hours a week at work. If you're not happy at your job, that's going to make for a very significant damper on your happiness of your life. Here's another line. In a country well governed, poverty is something to be ashamed of. So in our country, there is poverty. There's lots of poverty, probably too much poverty. And if we are proud of our country, then maybe we should be a little critical of how much pride we have, given that there's still poverty, especially because of mass amounts of wealth that we have in our country. And Confucius continues here, in a country badly governed, wealth is something to be ashamed of. So if there's a corrupt state or country and there's wealth, that is usually indicative that there's some kind of injustice. And the corruption of the badly governed people is the reason why there's concentration of wealth. Here's another one that's this very different line of thought. And remember, no matter where you go, there you are. It's just kind of a no-brainer. It's trivially true. It's kind of automatically true. You could argue this is a tautology, something that is necessarily true. It would be impossible for it to be false. You might have heard of a saying similar to this one that is attributed to Confucius. Give a bowl of rice to a man and you will feed him for one day. Teach him how to grow his own rice and you will save his life. The other variations of this, especially with fish. Give a person a fish, you'll feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish and you'll feed him for his life. A lot of conservative-minded political people will argue that welfare is okay, it helps people out, but what would be better is if you can give people training and give people jobs, and they'll be much better off if they can provide for themselves. It's almost disrespectful just to give someone money or food because you're kind of presuming that they're not going to be able to get it on their own. If you respect their humanity, you will train them or hire them or teach them how to do something because they're human beings, and this is a capacity that we all potentially have. I mentioned before that the yin-yang symbol shows up in Confucianism as well as Taoism, but another symbol that you will see in this tradition is the water symbol, and there it is on your screen. and it is a source of life. Water is. This also can be translated as code of conduct. Why water? Well, there's something pure about water. As I mentioned, it is the reason for the existence of life. When uh, um, when scientists are looking at other planets for potential intelligent life, one of the first things that they search for is evidence of water, because as far as we know, it would be very difficult for life to exist without water. So that's what they look for, water. If a government and society is going to work, then there need to be good relationships. There are 5 important relationships that are stressed by Confucius. Here are 3 of them. And you might want to pause and, based on the first 3, guess what number 4 and 5 are. So these are in no particular order: father to son, elder brother to younger brother, husband to wife. So you see a pattern here of a more senior person and their relationship to someone who might look up to them. And then, of course, in number 3 there, you see some inherent sexism, that the relationship there is not one of equals. There's one of subserviency and letting the husband be the leader of the family. So today, the way Confucianism plays out and looks was probably very different than how it's being depicted here. So 2 more relationships left, including elder to junior. So that's just in general, respect your elders. And then 5 is ruler to subject. All right, let's talk about human nature in Confucianism. If you had to guess, human nature is inherently good, Confucius would say. However, he includes this caveat that it can be corrupted. So at our core, we're basically good. That doesn't mean that we stay good. We can be corrupted by the choices we make in life. So there's a similarity there to Christianity. Human beings are made in the image of God, so we are inherently good in that sense. But there's also this idea of the fall, original sin, and the need of grace. We need God. We need Jesus to be saved. So some similarities there, but not entirely similar. To avoid this corruption of our human nature, what is necessary? Well, no surprise here, good government. So Confucius thought that's the key to the good life. And you can see here, there's no mention of priests. There's no worship of gods. You can see why someone might question whether or not this is a religion. Well, because of its rich history and the practices and the beliefs, it gets counted as a religion, although it doesn't resemble in every way some of the other traditions that we've been talking about. That's all I have for Confucianism. So since we have time on this lecture, why don't we jump in to our last tradition in the quote-unquote Eastern world, and that is a religion originating from Japan, which is sometimes called Shinto. Now, the word itself actually comes from Chinese terms, Shen and Dao. So we know that Dao is the way of nature. Shen in Chinese roughly means gods, so Shinto means the way of the gods. But for some, instead of Shinto, this religion is called Kami no Michi, which is a preferred term by many. One of the reasons why Shinto is a Chinese term is because up until a certain point, because of the isolation of Japan, there was no need to really name the religion to distinguish it from anything else, because there weren't any other cultures that interacted. But once there was a exchange of Japan with China, then you needed to say, well, this is the religion. Well, which religion? There's more than one now. So because to distinguish Shinto from, say, the spread of Buddhism, that's where you get this term. And since Buddhism spread to Japan by way of China, that's where you get the Chinese terms, Shen and Dao. It's not as old as Taoism and Buddhism and Confucianism. 1,500 years old, maybe a little bit older than that, but not the 2,500 years or more than 3,000 years that we see in other traditions. Now, the number of followers, that really is a big range because it depends on how you count an adherent of Shinto. So there are at least 2.5 million, but 65 plus million followers today. There's no known founder, of Shinto, just like there's no known founder of Hinduism. So there's a parallel there. The reason for this is it's just part of Japanese mythology. It's an ancient practice and belief system that's tied to nature, this religion is. There are these figures called the kami. These are nature gods, and this concept of animism. So you think animal maybe when you see that word, but it would be better to think of the word animation. Animators, they take still pictures and they put them, flip through them quickly, and then still pictures come to life. So animism is about being spiritually alive. The practitioners of Shinto believe that there is a spirituality to all aspects of nature, and this includes inanimate objects. So remember, in Jainism, there was the practice of ahimsa, which is the vow of non-injury to all living things. In Shinto, there's belief in animism, so it's not just plants and animals and human beings that are have inherent intrinsic value, but it's all aspects of nature, including inanimate objects. So this would include, of course, human beings and animals, but also plants and trees, but also seas, rivers, mountains, the sun, and the stars. So you could argue that there's a polytheism here, the idea that there is a religious aspect, there's a God aspect to all parts of the natural world. The Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, the Vedas, and now we add to our list of texts associated with religions, and we have the Kojiki and the Nihonji. The Kojiki and the Nihonji. These are the two main texts in Shinto. The Kojiki is ancient mythology and an origin story, which includes Japan as the center of the world. As human beings, we often see the world through our own lens, and if we are from a culture on this island nation of Japan, we might see that culture as center stage. It was a common belief that the Earth was at the center, and the stars and the moon, the other planets, and the sun revolved around us. This is just human tendency, human nature. So in the Kojiki, we have an origin story where Japan is at the center of the world. The ancient history of Japan is contained in the Nihonji. Part of the mythology is about a sun goddess named Amaterasu. Amaterasu is the sun goddess and believed to be the mother of the first emperor of Japan. And you can see there in the artwork below Amaterasu there in the center with the sun rays or beams radiating out in all directions and blessing the islands of Japan and the people who inhabit it. There are 3 important treasures, sacred treasures that are called the imperial regalia, sacred treasures. One of them is a sword. There's a virtue that is assigned to each of these relics, each of these treasures. The virtue associated with the sword is the virtue of valor. The second part of the regalia is the mirror, the virtue there being wisdom. And finally, the jewel, the virtue associated there being benevolence. And let's talk about the divisions within Shinto. We've talked about conservative and liberal sects and many of the traditions. There are 3 ones that I want you to know about from Shinto: state, sectarian, and domestic. Let's start with state Shinto. It emphasized the elimination of foreign influences, emphasized the belief that emperors are divine. So there you see a move from the political to the spiritual, the connection there. That the state and religion are really one. In the United States, we have a separation of church and state, but at this time in Japan, that wasn't the case. In 1889, the emperor took power from the priests. That was part of the 1889 constitution, and even there was a ban from priests, Shinto priests, from practicing. So you can see there was a division between the folk religion of the people and the state. The state recognized the potency of religion and its influence over Japanese citizens. And so the emperor recognized that if I could take over the role of all the priests that these people looked up to as leaders, then I would have more power. And the belief was that this would be in the best interest of Japan because it would represent a unity that would protect Japan from foreign influences and invasions. This union of the state and the religion continued into World War II, and over a period that's called the Meiji period, Meigi, the Meiji period. Then, in the 1940s, January 1946, the occupational forces directed at the emperor to issue a statement declaring that he was no longer divine. So if you know your history of World War II, there were soldiers from the military of Japan that were truly dedicated in their service to their cause, to the point where even after the insanity of the dropping of the nuclear weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the fighting still continued, and in part, people believe this was in part because the soldiers were not just following the orders of their version of a commander-in-chief, they were following the orders of God, because the emperor is not just a general or a leader of the army or soldiers. The emperor was God, and so it's one thing if a commander-in-chief commands you to fight for your country. It's an entirely other thing if you're getting that imperative from the divine, from God. State Shinto, and now we're going into the second division, sectarian, and this second sort of Shinto is actually going to be divided into three types: mountain worshippers, shamanism, and pure myth-based Shinto. This sectarian Shinto in general was really the people's reaction to state Shinto. So there was a pushing back, as it were, a minority group who was not happy that the emperor had, in a sense, stole the religion of the people. So these sorts of sectarian Shinto splintered off as a reaction to that. The mountain worshippers, they participated in pilgrimage, they worshiped nature, and practiced a sort of asceticism, a monk-like life that we saw in Jainism. Shamanism included the belief that ordinary peasants could be like shaman, like leaders in the community that had some sort of spiritual connection or power, even the power of healing. So there was this one shaman in particular who was a woman named Nakayama Miki, and it was believed that she could heal the sick. In pure myth-based Shinto, that sect is most similar like the yogis in Hinduism, and maybe a little bit similar to some of the Jains in that they were really into purifying the body, which is the goal of yoga. The body can become tainted and needs to be cleaned and cleansed, and that is what pure sectarian Shinto is all about. So now we're ready to go into the third sort of Shinto, the most general sort. We had states, then these three versions of sectarian, and now the third, more general type of Shinto, which is domestic Shinto. That's Shinto that is practiced domestically, hence the term domestic, practiced at home. And really, the only thing that I'm going to hold you responsible for that is one of these parts of domestic Shinto, these kamidanas that are god shelves, is just a little shrine that you might have in a home, and it might contain some rice wine that would be used to bless the names of ancestors written on pieces of paper, and might contain relics from neighborhood Shinto temples. It might also contain statues of gods that have been beneficial to the family. For a really short video, you can tell that this is not professionally done. It looks like it's just maybe an American who did a study abroad in Japan and has a little clip of a kamidana inside an ordinary person's home. And as you can see, it's just like the religious objects that some of you might have had in your homes. So if you are Jewish, you might have a menorah. If you're a Christian, you might have a cross on the wall. This is sort of the equivalent of that, and it's just on a shelf there, in between the Lysol and the plates and whatnot. This is just something that would be practiced at home. Here are some images of Shinto temples, which are often called shrines. And one thing I want you to know about them is there is an inner and outer shrine. So here we can see the outer part, obviously, and in the next image you can kind of see into the inner part. The outer part is available for everyone, but it's really only priests and government officials who can enter into the inner part of the shrine. And for many of these shrines, it's required that they're rebuilt every 20 years. So this image is a little bit blurry, but you can kind of see in there, there's it's kind of almost a porch-like part of the shrine that goes around, and then there is a part that is deeper in there that's reserved, as I mentioned, for the priests and government officials. The symbol in Shinto is called the Tori, T-O-R, and then double I. So people ask about what's going on with the water, and that's just a part of the season. So it's the different seasons. The water, the tide is higher than others. Here is actually a torii that is in Hollister, California. That is my grandmother's backyard. So she took an interest, not so much in Shinto to practice it, but she just thought that it looked beautiful, and she said, I think that it is just a gorgeous thing, and I want one in my backyard. You can see there's a little bench there. Here's another picture of the torii that's in my grandmother's backyard in Hollister. The last thing we're going to talk about for Shinto is some of their philosophical beliefs, which includes the doctrine of three truths in one. So the three sorts of truths, but they all come together in the end. The first truth is conventional reality. This is human reality. This is the subjective reality. This is reality as it appears to each of us as individuals. This is an everyday reality. This is a reality of rocks and chairs and people and the kind of mundane things that make up our life and our daily activity. ultimate reality is this deeper sense of truth. It goes beyond the conventions. It's how things are really. And just like in Buddhism, there's belief that the conventional reality that we live in is just an appearance. Remember, we saw that in Buddhism with the concept of Anatman, and in Hinduism, the belief in Maya, that there's a lot of illusion that we are susceptible to in our lives. So the ultimate reality is that things are really illusory. Now, in Hinduism, that's where the truth ends, is we're supposed to kind of discover these illusions, and that will help us escape from this endless cycle. But in Shinto, the third truth, three truths in one, kind of combines all of these together in a sense, and that's called the middle way. And the middle way is, we know that term from Buddhism, but in Shinto, the middle way is a little bit different. It's the idea that there is something going for both one and two. So this is how Shinto differs from, say, Buddhism and Hinduism. It's different because in those other traditions, the truth is really just two, and one is kind of a lie that we have to get past. But in Shinto, there's still an allowance of the importance of conventional reality. Yes, it might be an illusory in a deep philosophical sense, but in a practical sense, we need to engage in this illusion, this world of rocks and chairs and tables and people and homework and commuting and bureaucracy and voting. We have to do that just to kind of get along in our daily lives. So there's still something important about that, even if ultimately it is not of consequence. So the middle way is the idea that both one and two are true, that there's an importance to not just ultimate reality, but to conventional reality as well.